Oh, honey, let me tell you, there are some wounds time just doesn't fully heal, not when they cut right to the bone of your own flesh and blood. I still remember the exact moment, clear as a bell, when those words, sharp as shards of glass, flew from my eldest Sarah, right across my own kitchen table. You eat, but you don't help. My hands, still warm from kneading dough for the supper rolls, just froze there, hovering over the flour-dusted counter. They thought I was just some old woman, a burden. But what they didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was the secret I held. A secret that would soon turn their carefully constructed world upside down and finally bring me the justice I deserved. It was a Tuesday evening. I remember, the 3rd of March, 2 years ago now. The clock on the mantelpiece, the one my George had given me our first Christmas, was ticking away, a steady, relentless rhythm, like a drumbeat to my growing heartache. The smell of my famous pot roast, slow cooking all afternoon, usually filled the old farmhouse with comfort. But that night, it just felt heavy. We were all gathered, as always, for supper, Sarah and her husband, Mark, my son, Thomas, and his wife, Brenda, and even little Lily, my youngest granddaughter, usually a ray of sunshine, was quiet, picking at her green beans. It had been like this for months, this slow, simmering resentment. Ever since George passed, God rest his soul, things had shifted. They saw a widow, frail and fading, not the woman who'd helped George build this farm from the ground up, brick by aching brick, dollar by hard-earned dollar. They saw someone to be tolerated, not respected. "Mama, are you going to just sit there?" Sarah's voice, always a little too loud these days, sliced through the quiet. "The plates aren't going to clear themselves." I bit back the sharp retort that threatened to escape. "Mama built this kitchen, Sarah, and Mama cooked this meal?" But what was the point? It felt like I was talking to a wall. I just nodded, a small tired nod, and started gathering the chipped stoneware plates. My hands, gnarled with a lifetime of work, trembled ever so slightly. It wasn't just Sarah. Thomas, my own son, my little boy I'd nursed through scarlet fever, would barely look me in the eye unless he needed something. Brenda, his wife, well, she always had that tight, polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. They all lived under this roof, the house George and I had poured our lives into. But it felt less and less like my home and more like a hotel where I was an unwelcome guest. The farm had been struggling, that much was true. The market prices for corn and soybeans hadn't been kind, and the old tractor, faithful as it was, needed constant repairs. George had always handled the finances, a meticulous man with ledgers and a firm hand. After he was gone, they'd simply taken over. "Don't you worry your head about it, Mama," Thomas had said, patting my shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a dismissal than comfort. "We'll handle everything. You just rest. Rest." As if I was some delicate porcelain doll. I'd worked harder in my life than they could ever imagine. From sunup to sundown, milking cows, tending the garden, raising 2 children, mending clothes, cooking 3 square meals a day, and still finding time to put up preserves. Rest was a luxury, not a way of life. The first sting, a real, undeniable jab, came about 6 months after George's funeral. The old cedar chest in the attic, where George kept his important papers, had always been locked. He'd given me the key years ago, a tiny, intricately carved brass key I wore on a chain around my neck, hidden beneath my blouse. One afternoon, I went up there, a sudden urge to look at his old war medals, to feel close to him again. But when I reached for the chest, the lid wasn't quite flush. And when I tried my key, it wouldn't turn. It was already unlocked. My heart gave a little lurch. Someone had been in there. And sure enough, the small, heavy oak box where George kept his will and the farm deeds was open, and the documents were gone. I confronted Thomas and Sarah that evening, trying to keep my voice steady, but a tremor crept in. "Have either of you seen your father's will? Or the deeds to the farm?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. Sarah, ever the bolder one, met my eyes with a challenging glint. "Oh, Mama, we just took them down to get things in order," she said, too casually. "Legal stuff, you know. Make sure everything's squared away for everyone." "For everyone?" I repeated, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. George and I always intended for the farm to stay whole, to be passed down. He made sure I was provided for, always. Of course, Mama, Thomas interjected, finally looking at me, but his eyes were guarded. We're just making sure it's done properly. There are taxes, you know, debts. I didn't press it further then. George had always been a private man about money, but he'd also been fiercely protective of me. I trusted him. I had to believe they were just being helpful, though a tiny, persistent voice in my head whispered otherwise. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The old house creaked and groaned around me, sounding less like a comfort and more like a warning. The snubs grew more frequent, more pointed. Family meetings, held in the living room George and I had painstakingly wallpapered, became regular occurrences, but I was rarely included. I'd overhear snippets from the kitchen. The expenses are too high, or she doesn't understand the market. They'd stop talking the moment I walked in, like children caught with their hands in the cookie jar. My opinion, once valued, was now dismissed with a wave of a hand. Mama, it's really not your concern, Thomas would say, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. One particularly bitter morning, I found a pile of unopened mail addressed to me on the kitchen counter. Among them was a statement from the local bank, the one where George and I had kept our joint savings account. Only it wasn't a joint account anymore. It was just his name and the balance. It was practically zero. George had always been so careful, so frugal. We had a substantial nest egg put aside for our old age, for emergencies. My heart hammered against my ribs. What happened to the money? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, holding up the statement. Sarah snatched it from my hand. Oh, that old thing. Thomas handled it. We had to pay off some of the farm's debts, Mama. You wouldn't want the bank foreclosing, would you? But our savings, I stammered, feeling lightheaded. George said it was for us, for me. He promised. Well, things change, Mama, Brenda chimed in, her voice dripping with false sympathy. The farm is the priority now. It's the family's legacy, isn't it? Legacy. It was always about the legacy. But somehow, my legacy, my comfort, my peace of mind, had been conveniently forgotten. I felt a hot flush of anger, but also a deep, soul-shaking fear. What if they were right? What if there was nothing left? What if I truly was a burden? The thought was a bitter pill. I knew deep down that George would never have left me destitute. He loved me more than life itself. This was wrong. This was profoundly, terribly wrong. It wasn't just the money, though. That was a huge part of it. It was the constant chipping away at my dignity. I loved to bake, always had. My pecan pies were legendary at the county fair. But when I'd suggest baking something for the church fundraiser, Sarah would say, "Oh, Mama, don't you think that's a bit much for you? Why don't you just rest?" My garden, my beautiful vegetable garden that fed us all summer, was slowly being neglected. Thomas would say he didn't have time to till the rows, and Sarah would complain about the weeds. It was like they were systematically erasing every trace of me, every contribution I made to this home. This family, this farm, the breaking point. The moment I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer came with the old family portrait. It hung in the living room, above the fireplace, a slightly faded photograph of George and me on our wedding day, young and full of hope, alongside pictures of our children as toddlers. One afternoon I walked into the living room and it was gone. In its place hung a bland landscape print Brenda had picked up at a yard sale. My breath hitched. Where is our portrait? Thomas shuffled his feet. Oh, Mama, it was just getting a bit old, you know. Brenda thought something new would brighten the place up. Something new. Something without me. Without George. It was a clear message, unspoken, but screamingly loud. You don't belong here anymore. Not really. My heart ached with a pain so sharp I thought it might shatter. That night, I cried into my pillow. Quiet sobs that wouldn't disturb anyone, wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd finally broken me. But as the tears dried, a different feeling began to take root, a hard, cold resolve. They thought I was an old woman ready for the scrap heap. They thought I was blind, deaf, and too frail to fight. They were wrong, so terribly, spectacularly wrong. I knew I couldn't stay there and wither away. I had to leave. But where would I go? And how? The fear was still there, a cold dread, but beneath it, a tiny ember of defiance began to glow. And I remembered a name George had mentioned years ago, a distant cousin he'd helped out, someone who owed him a favor, someone I might need to call upon. My eyes fell on the old, tarnished silver locket George had given me, nestled on my bedside table. Inside, tucked away, was a tiny folded piece of paper. A number, a name, a last resort. I knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my true story, the one they never expected, was just beginning, and it would shake them to their core. My mind was made up. I would leave, but how? I had no money, no car, no place to go. I was trapped, or so they thought. But they underestimated the resourcefulness born of a lifetime on a farm, a life lived through droughts and floods, through lean years and hard times. They'd stripped me of my dignity, yes, but not my spirit. The next morning I began to plan. I started small, observing their routines, the times they left for town, for church, for farm errands. I began to squirrel away little things. A handful of my old silver dollars George had given me, hidden in an antique teapot. A small, worn, leather-bound address book with contacts from my quilting circle. A faded photograph of my great-grandmother tucked into my worn Bible. These were small acts of rebellion, but they were mine. The biggest challenge was the money. They had drained my accounts, or so I believed. But George, bless his careful heart, had always been one for contingencies. He'd had a small separate account, a secret one, just for me, for my mad money, as he called it, something for if ever I needed to escape to a spa or buy a silly hat. He'd set it up years ago, telling me to keep the details close to my chest. Just in case, Martha, you never know. I'd forgotten about it. Honestly, lost in the daily rhythm of farm life. But now, a flicker of hope ignited. The account details were written on a yellowed index card, tucked into the spine of a cookbook, hidden behind a recipe for apple pie. It took me 3 days to find a moment alone, 3 agonizing days of pretending nothing was wrong, of enduring their condescending remarks. Finally, on a Wednesday morning, Thomas and Mark were out in the far fields. Brenda had gone to the market, and Sarah was at her book club. The house was blissfully, terrifyingly empty. My hands trembled as I retrieved the card. The bank was in the next town over, a place I rarely went. How would I get there? The old truck sat in the barn, but I hadn't driven in years. And even if I could, they'd notice it was gone. I needed a distraction, a reason for them not to question my absence immediately. Then it hit me. Mrs. Gable, down the road, she'd been asking for help with her prize-winning rose bushes. She was a kindly soul, a little deaf, but sharp as a tack. I could tell them I was going to help her and that she'd be driving me. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was all I had. I put on my good dress, the one I usually saved for church, and my sensible walking shoes. I clutched the index card in my hand, my palms sweating. Just as I was about to leave, I saw it. A tiny, almost invisible slip of paper peeking out from under the old porcelain cat on the mantelpiece. It was a note in George's distinctive, neat handwriting. "Martha, my love, remember the box. It's for you, only for you. The box, what box?" I racked my brain, but nothing came to mind. Another secret? George had so many, it seemed. But there was no time to investigate now. I had to go. The walk to Mrs. Gable's felt like miles. My legs ached, but adrenaline propelled me forward. Mrs. Gable, bless her heart, was surprised but delighted to see me. When I explained, as vaguely as possible, that I needed to run an errand in town and would she mind giving me a lift, she didn't hesitate. "Of course, dear, hop in. I need some new potting soil anyway." The bank manager, a young man named Mr. Harrison, who remembered George fondly, was surprised to see me. He pulled up the account, and my heart soared as I saw the balance. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to get me started, enough to buy my freedom. I withdrew a substantial portion, enough to live on for a while, and asked for the rest to be transferred to a new account, in a different bank, in a different town, under my maiden name. I felt a surge of power, a sense of vindication. This was my money, money George had specifically set aside for me. They hadn't gotten it all. Back at the farmhouse, I pretended to be exhausted from helping Mrs. Gable, collapsing onto the old sofa. Sarah gave me a look of thinly veiled annoyance, but didn't press. That night, I carefully packed a small duffel bag with a few essentials, my Bible, the photograph of George and me, a change of clothes, and most importantly, the cash I'd withdrawn, tucked deep inside a false bottom in an old hat box. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and exhilaration. I was actually going to do it, I was going to leave. But where? The name on the little slip of paper from George's locket came to mind again. Cousin Amelia. George had mentioned her only once or twice, saying she lived in a small town upstate, a couple of hours away. A long shot, but it was all I had. As I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the old house, I felt a strange sense of detachment. This wasn't my home anymore. It was a cage, and I was about to fly free. I remembered the note from George about the box. What could it be? And what secrets did it hold? I knew then, with a growing sense of certainty, that this was more than just about my escape. It was about uncovering the truth, about reclaiming what was rightfully mine, and about honoring George's memory. The real battle, I realized, was just beginning. But first I had to get out. I just had to wait for the perfect moment. And that moment, I instinctively knew, was coming soon. The 2 days I waited for my chance to leave were the longest of my life. I moved through the house like a ghost, a polite smile plastered on my face while a storm raged inside me. Every tick of George's clock on the mantel was a countdown. Every meal I ate at that table felt like a betrayal to myself, but I swallowed it down, along with my pride. I was playing a part, the role of the frail, forgetful old woman they wanted me to be. And oh honey, they bought it hook, line, and sinker. The perfect moment finally came on a Friday morning, before the sun had even thought about stretching its golden fingers over the fields. Thomas and Mark were leaving early for a livestock auction 2 counties over. They wouldn't be back until late, if at all. Sarah had an appointment with her hairdresser in town at 9, and Brenda always slept in. The house was asleep. Or so I hoped. I slipped out of bed, the floorboards groaning a soft protest under my bare feet. I didn't even dare turn on a lamp. I dressed in the dark, my hands moving with a sureness that surprised even me, pulling on my traveling clothes I'd laid out. I grabbed the old hat box, the weight of the cash inside a solid, reassuring presence. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, so loud I was certain it would wake the entire house. Every creak of the stairs was a thunderclap. Every shadow seemed to hold a waiting figure. When I finally reached the back door, my hand trembled so badly it took me 3 tries to turn the knob. The click of the latch unlocking sounded like a gunshot in the silent kitchen. I froze for a second, my breath caught in my throat, listening. Nothing. Just the gentle hum of the old refrigerator and the distant, lonely call of a mourning dove. I slipped out into the pre-dawn chill, the damp grass cool against my ankles, and I did not look back. If I had, I knew my courage would have failed me. The walk to the crossroads where the early bus stopped was nearly 2 miles. The old leather duffel bag felt heavier with every step, and the hat box was awkward to carry, but I clutched them like they were my very salvation. When the bus finally rumbled into view, its headlights cutting through the morning mist, tears of relief pricked my eyes. I paid my fare with one of the crisp bills from the hat box and sank into a worn vinyl seat by the window. As the bus pulled away, I watched my life, the farm I had built with my own 2 hands, the home I had raised my children in, shrink into the distance until it was just a dark shape against the rising sun. I felt a pang of profound loss, a grief so sharp it stole my breath. But underneath it, for the first time in a very long time, I felt a flicker of something else. Freedom. The journey passed in a blur of rolling hills and unfamiliar small towns. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, the bus driver was calling out, "Evergreen Creek!" My destination. My heart gave a little leap of anxiety. What if Cousin Amelia didn't remember me? What if she turned me away? I was an old woman, alone in a strange town, with a bag full of cash and a head full of worries. Taking a deep breath, I stepped off the bus into the bright afternoon sun. Evergreen Creek was a charming little place, with a town square and shops with colorful awnings. I found a payphone, a real relic, and with a trembling finger, I dialed the number from the slip of paper in my locket. A woman's voice, crackly but firm, answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello? Amelia?" I asked, my own voice sounding small and reedy. This is Martha. Martha Miller, George's wife." There was a pause on the other end, and my stomach plummeted. Then the voice warmed. "Martha! Good heavens, child, is that really you? After all these years, where in the world are you? I'm here, I stammered. In Evergreen Creek, at the bus station. Well, don't you move a muscle, Amelia declared. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Look for a bright yellow Beetle that's seen better days. True to her word, a car that looked like a cheerful lemon on wheels sputtered up to the curb a few minutes later. Behind the wheel was a woman with a cloud of white hair pinned up haphazardly and eyes as sharp and bright as a hawk's. Amelia was a force of nature. She enveloped me in a hug that smelled of lavender and turpentine. I later learned she was an artist and insisted on carrying my bags. Her little house was a kaleidoscope of color, filled with paintings and books and mismatched furniture. It was cluttered and chaotic, and to me, it felt like the safest place on earth. That evening, over a pot of strong tea and a plate of shortbread cookies, I told her everything. The words just poured out of me, the whispers, the neglect, the missing will, the drained bank account, Sarah's cruel words. Amelia listened patiently, her bright eyes never leaving my face, a thunderous expression growing on her features. When I was finished, my voice hoarse with unshed tears, she reached across the table and took my gnarled hand in her own. Martha, she said, her voice low and fierce, those children of yours aren't just ungrateful. That's fraud. What they've done is illegal. But I have no proof, I whispered, the old despair creeping back in. They have the will, the deeds. They control everything. George was a smart man, Amelia said, tapping a finger on the table for emphasis. A careful man. He wouldn't have left you unprotected. Are you absolutely certain there's nothing else? No other papers? A safe deposit box? Anything? I shook my head, my mind a blank. And then, as I looked at the old carved wooden chest Amelia used as a coffee table, something flickered. A memory so faint it was like smoke. George, standing in the doorway of the old smokehouse, the one we hadn't used in 30 years. He was holding a metal box, an old army footlocker. This is for a rainy day, Martha, he'd said with a wink. The real rainy day, my eyes widened. The box, I breathed. What box? Amelia leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with intensity. George's note, I explained, my words tumbling over each other. The one I found before I left. It said, remember the box. It's for you. Only for you. I think I know where it is. The old smokehouse. It was at the far edge of the property, half hidden by overgrown lilac bushes. No one ever went out there. It was full of spiders and junk. Perfect for hiding something. But how could I get to it? I was hours away. I couldn't just go back. Amelia, bless her practical heart, had a solution. Mrs. Gable, she said, snapping her fingers. The neighbor you mentioned. You trust her, don't you? With my life, I said without hesitation. Then we're going to call her, Amelia announced, grabbing the phone. My heart pounded as I explained the situation to Mrs. Gable, praying she would understand, praying she would believe me. She listened to the whole sordid tale without interruption. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. That's Sarah, she finally said, her voice tight with indignation. I never did like the look in her eyes. Don't you worry, Martha. You tell me where that box is, and I'll get it for you if I have to crawl through a snake pit. I described the location as best I could. Under the third floorboard to the left of the old curing stove, tucked back in the corner. Mrs. Gable promised to go that very night, after dark, and to call me from a neighbor's phone as soon as she had it. The wait was torture. Every time the phone rang, I jumped. Amelia and I sat in her cozy living room, barely speaking, the air thick with anticipation. Finally, close to midnight, the call came. I have it, Martha, Mrs. Gable whispered, her voice crackling over the line. It's heavy. And it was right where you said. They'll never know I was there. She agreed to send it by courier the very next morning, marked as a package of antique linens. 2 days later, a large, securely wrapped parcel arrived. My hands shook so badly Amelia had to help me cut the twine. Inside was a dusty, dented olive-green metal footlocker, the army kind. On the front, stenciled in faded white paint, were George's initials, GWM. It was locked with a simple padlock, the kind I'd seen him use in the barn 100 times. The key. Where would the key be? And then I remembered. The tiny brass key I wore on the chain around my neck. The one I thought was for his old cedar chest. The one that hadn't worked. With a surge of adrenaline, I pulled the chain from under my blouse. I slid the key into the padlock. It turned. With a soft, satisfying click, the lock sprang open. Amelia and I looked at each other, our breath held. Slowly, I lifted the heavy lid. On top lay a thick sealed manila envelope. My name, Martha Ann Miller, was written across the front in George's familiar, steady hand. My eyes filled with tears. Inside that envelope was his real will, the last one he'd ever made, dated just 1 year before he passed. It was signed and notarized by Mr. Henderson, our old family lawyer in the city, not the new one Thomas and Sarah had been using. And the terms were crystal clear. The farm, the house, all the equipment, and all monetary accounts were to be left solely and entirely to me, his beloved wife. The children were to receive a small, fixed inheritance upon my passing, provided, and he had underlined the word twice. They had shown me care and respect. Beneath the will was a stack of letters, tied with a blue ribbon, all addressed to me. And beneath those letters, wrapped in oilcloth, were the original official deeds to the farm, free and clear, with my name listed as the sole proprietor. They had shown me a fake, a forgery. The account they'd drained wasn't our main savings. It was a secondary farm operations account. The real nest egg, the one George had so carefully built for us, was in a different bank, an investment account they clearly knew nothing about. The statements were all there, showing a balance that made my head spin. I wasn't a burden. I was a wealthy woman. I sank back into the chair, the papers clutched in my hands, a wave of dizziness washing over me. He had protected me. Even from beyond the grave, George had protected me. He had seen the greed in his own children's hearts long before I had. The first letter on top began, "My dearest Martha, if you are reading this, then I fear the worst has happened, and our children have not honored my trust. I am so sorry you have to face this alone, but you are not alone. You are the strongest woman I have ever known. In this box is your sword and your shield. Use them. Fight for what is ours. Fight for your peace." A single tear rolled down my cheek and splashed onto the paper. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of fury, of resolve, of love. He had given me a sword and a shield, and by God, I was going to use them. Just then, the phone rang, shrill and demanding in the quiet room. Amelia answered it, her face hardening as she listened. "It's for you," she said, holding out the receiver. "It's Sarah." I took the phone, my hand steady now. My heart was calm, beating with a slow, powerful rhythm. "Mama? Where are you?" Sarah's voice was a screech of panic and accusation. "We've been worried sick. You just disappeared. Your bed wasn't slept in. Are you trying to give us a heart attack?" I took a slow, deliberate breath. The old Martha, the timid, frightened woman from a few days ago, was gone. In her place was someone new, someone forged in betrayal and strengthened by the truth. "No, Sarah," I said, my voice as cool and clear as a winter morning. "I'm not trying to give you a heart attack. I'm just getting my affairs in order." "What are you talking about? What affairs? You need to come home right now. We need to—" I cut her off. "I don't think so," I said quietly. "There's something you and Thomas need to see first. Something your father left for me." I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting her panic build. Then I delivered the final blow. "I found the box, Sarah, your father's real box." The silence on the other end of the line was more telling than any scream. It stretched on for a full 10 seconds, a hollow, buzzing void where Sarah's bluster used to be. I could almost hear the frantic turning of the gears in her mind, the denial warring with a cold spike of fear. When she finally spoke, her voice was a strangled whisper. What are you talking about? What box?" "Oh, you know," I said, my voice as calm as a summer pond. I felt Amelia's hand on my shoulder, a small, steady pressure. "The one your father was smart enough to hide from you. The one with his last will and testament. The one that tells the real story." "You're lying," she hissed. But the venom was gone, replaced by a desperate, cracking uncertainty. "You're a confused old woman. We're coming to get you. Where are you?" "Don't trouble yourselves," I said, and a strength I didn't know I possessed flowed through me. "I'll be coming to you. Be at the house, Sunday, 2 o'clock. Have Thomas and your husband there as well. We have some family matters to discuss." And with that, I gently placed the receiver back in its cradle, cutting off her sputtering reply. I looked at Amelia, whose eyes were shining with a fierce, protective pride. "Well," Amelia said, pouring me another cup of tea with a steady hand. "That's the appetizer. Now we prepare the main course." The next day, Amelia drove me into the city to see the lawyer George had used, Mr. Henderson's successor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diana Albright. She had kind eyes but a jawline that looked like it was carved from granite. We sat in her quiet, book-lined office as she examined the documents from the box, her expression growing more serious with each page she turned. She looked at the forged will Sarah and Thomas had filed, then at the real one from the box. She compared the deeds. She read the bank statements. Finally, she took off her reading glasses and folded her hands on her large oak desk. She looked straight at me. "Mrs. Miller," she said, her voice rich with conviction, "this isn't just a will. This is a fortress. George built you a fortress. What your children have done constitutes probate fraud, forgery, and illegal conversion of assets. To put it plainly, they could go to prison for this. Prison." The word hung in the air, heavy and ugly. As much as they had hurt me, the thought of my own children behind bars sent a chill through my soul. I saw them as toddlers again, their small hands clutching my fingers. It was a mother's curse, I suppose, to love the very people who break your heart. I looked at Ms. Albright and shook my head slowly. "I don't want them in jail," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I want my home back. I want my life back. I want them to understand." Ms. Albright nodded, her expression softening with empathy. "I understand," she said. "Justice can take many forms. We will proceed exactly as you wish, but we will proceed from a position of absolute, undeniable strength." The drive back to the farm that Sunday was the strangest journey of my life. This time I wasn't fleeing in the darkness, a frightened refugee. I was returning in the broad daylight, with Ms. Albright at my side, the truth sitting in a handsome leather briefcase on the seat between us. As we turned down the long, familiar gravel lane, I saw it all with new eyes. The slant of the old barn roof, the way the sunlight caught the glass in the kitchen window, the towering oak tree George and I had planted as a sapling. A wave of emotion washed over me, not grief or anger, but a fierce, possessive love. This was mine. It had always been mine. They were all there, just as I'd instructed, gathered in the living room like they were waiting for a verdict. Sarah, Thomas, Mark, and Brenda. They stood up when I walked in. The expressions on their faces were a mixture of apprehension, defiance, and confusion. Sarah's eyes immediately darted to Miss Albright, her face tightening. "Mama, who is this?" she demanded, gesturing towards my lawyer. "This is Miss Albright," I said simply, walking past them to stand in my old spot by the fireplace. The spot where my wedding portrait should have been. "She's my legal counsel." "Legal counsel? What on earth for?" Thomas blustered, but he couldn't meet my eyes. He just kept looking at the floor, his face pale. I didn't answer him. I just looked at each of them, one by one, letting the silence hang in the air. The clock on the mantel ticked, a steady, solemn rhythm. Finally I spoke. "I was told," I began, my voice clear and steady, "that I eat, but I don't help. I was made to feel like a guest in my own home, a burden." I saw Sarah flinch. "You took my husband's will, you drained our savings. You removed every trace of me you could, all while telling me to rest and not to worry my head about things." "Mama, we were just trying to manage things," Sarah burst out, her voice high and strained. "The farm has debts. We were protecting the family legacy." "My husband," I said, my voice dropping, cold and hard, "did not leave this farm in debt, and he certainly did not leave me unprotected." Miss Albright stepped forward and opened her briefcase on the coffee table. The sound of the latches clicking open was as loud as a judge's gavel. She laid out the documents one by one. "This," she said, holding up the notarized will from the box, "is George Miller's final legal testament. It leaves the entirety of the Miller farm, property, and all financial assets to his wife, Martha Miller. The document you filed with the county is a previously nullified version, making its submission an act of fraud." She then laid out the original deeds. "These deeds confirm Mrs. Miller as the sole proprietor." Then came the bank statements. "And these statements show a portfolio of assets your clients were clearly unaware of and which they had no legal right to access." The color drained from their faces. Brenda sank onto the couch as if her legs had given out. Mark stared, his mouth agape. Thomas finally looked up at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. Only Sarah kept fighting. This is ridiculous. She spat. It's a trick! She's a senile old woman. She could have been manipulated. I knew this was the moment. I reached into my purse and pulled out the small stack of letters from George, the ones tied with the blue ribbon. My hands did not tremble. I untied the ribbon and chose the last letter he ever wrote. Your father, I said, my voice thick with emotion, saw this coming. He saw the greed in your hearts. And he wrote me this. I began to read. My dearest Martha, my love. If you are holding this letter, it means I am gone, and our children have let me down in the most profound way. I pray it is not so, but I have seen the way they look at what we have built, not as a home, but as an inheritance. Not as a legacy of love, but as a collection of assets. They have forgotten that the value of this farm is not in the acreage, but in the life we lived here, the family we raised, the sweat and the tears and the laughter that soaked into this very soil. For this, I am deeply, deeply sorry. Forgive me for the pain they have caused you. But do not forgive their actions. What is ours is yours. You are the heart of this farm, Martha. You always were. Be strong. Take back what is yours. Live your life with the peace and dignity you so richly deserve. All my love, forever, George. When I finished, the room was utterly silent, save for a choked sob that escaped from Thomas. He crumpled into a chair and buried his face in his hands. The truth, in his father's own words, had finally broken through. Even Sarah stood frozen, her face a mask of shock, the fight finally gone from her eyes. The ghost of their father was in the room, and his disappointment was a weight they could not bear. They waited for my judgment. I could have told them to pack their bags. I could have called the sheriff. Miss Albright had already told me I had every right. But looking at their shattered faces, I didn't feel triumph. I just felt a deep, aching sadness for what our family had become. Revenge was not what I wanted. I wanted restoration. Here is what is going to happen, I said, my voice ringing with an authority they had never heard from me before. You will all continue to live here. This is, for now, your home. But let me be perfectly clear. You are living in my house, on my farm. Thomas and Mark, you will work the land, and you will report to me on all farm business. You will be paid a fair wage, and nothing more. Sarah and Brenda, you will contribute to the running of this household as equal partners. My name goes back on the bank accounts. My decisions are final. I paused, letting it sink in. Your inheritance, the one George set aside for you in his real will, is now entirely conditional upon your actions. You will earn it back, not with money, but with respect, with kindness, with the love a family is supposed to show. I then walked over to the bland landscape print above the fireplace. I lifted it off the hook myself and set it on the floor, face down. Tomorrow, I said, looking directly at Thomas, you will drive into the attic, and you will bring down the portrait of your father and me. And you will hang it back where it belongs. And that's how it was. The shift was immediate and absolute. The power in the house had tilted back to its rightful center. There were months of awkward silence, of strained politeness, but slowly, painstakingly, things began to change. Thomas, full of a shame that seemed to have humbled him to his very core, started talking to me again, asking my advice about the crops, just like he did when he was a boy. Brenda started joining me in the garden, and we found a quiet understanding among the tomato vines. Sarah was the hardest, her pride a bitter pill for her to swallow, but even she, in time, began to soften. One evening, she came into the kitchen while I was kneading dough and quietly asked, "Can you show me how you do that? The way the rolls are always so light?" It was a start. I reclaimed my life. I had my portrait rehung, my garden tilled, and my kitchen filled with the smells of baking once more. With a portion of the money from George's secret account, I set up a scholarship at the local high school for students wanting to study agriculture. A legacy in George's name that would actually do some good in the world. I found joy again, not in spite of what happened, but because of it. I had learned that I was stronger than I ever thought possible. You see, honey, a person's worth isn't determined by how useful others think you are. It's something you carry inside you, a fire that no amount of neglect or disrespect can ever truly extinguish. Sometimes you just need to be pushed to your absolute limit to realize that you have the power to burn brighter than ever before. My children tried to take my inheritance, but in the end, they gave me something far more valuable, myself. And that's a story I thought was worth telling. It's a lesson that took me a lifetime to learn, and I hope it helps someone listening right now. If my story has touched your heart, or maybe reminded you of your own strength, perhaps you could share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like to hear more stories from this old granny, they say you can subscribe to the channel. I'm still getting the hang of all this new technology, but I'd be honored to have you. Thank you for listening.